And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, private eyes, they're watching you.
Mm-hmm.
Private eyes. It seems that a lot of the surveillance research that we've been doing has been bearing a lot of fruit, particularly when it comes to space operations and the deep state and how that relates to the continuity of government program. Tonight, something very special for you there in the Ideas Room. This is X Series Special Report, Deep State in Space, the COG UFO File Revealed, which I added a subtitle, The Filer File Revealed, in reference to Air Force Major George Filer, who put something rather extraordinary on the record relating not only to the UFO phenomena, but to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're going to cover both tonight, and it's very interesting. There was quite a blackout on Filer, and I started to examine that also because he came out with some kind of remarkable things in 2019 related to his experience in the Air Force, working with some of the top people, including JFK, Curtis LeMay, and others over the years, and his extraordinary experiences of interviewing. He was the Air Force intelligence officer, and he's in the Air Force. He's interviewing all these different people who've had UFO encounters, and when he discusses his own and the protocols that were put in place, a number of things are going to click into place through this figure that will allow us to understand how the deep state operates in the continuity of government space relating to the UFO file. This is the crucial aspect. And, we had that great tragedy today in Russia. And of course, instantly when we're at this warlike stance and something terrible happens in any country, it casts suspicions around. So it's a very dangerous situation, our setup, regardless of who is responsible over there for that. It's very important that we nail why the relations over and over again turn sour between the US and Russia and who's behind it. What is the entity that's behind it? And what is the purpose? You're not going to be surprised if I tell you that the UFO file is at the very heart of this adversarial back and forth that is over and over again reanimated for this deep state. And it couldn't be for what you would consider normal purposes, because again and again, we find that the people who are perpetrating it seem to be puppets, front people for this other apparatus. And we're going to dig in to what that other apparatus is tonight. This special episode we're going to cover is going to crisscross directly with the X Protect work that we do here on this channel. And I wanted to mention before we get started in earnest, of course, we're going to do questions in the second part of tonight's program. Tonight is a special report. We're just going to do about 90 minutes with you. And in the second half, we're going to take questions, which Miss Olivia will take anytime you can ask them, and she'll put them together. And we'll get to those. But we're very anxious to hear your Ideas Room questions. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay.
How's the
Our
temperature
veil
out there?
says it is William Shatner's birthday today.
Oh, that's great. Well, Captain Kirk, there is no replacement. It's interesting, of course, this is also the Yale Skull and Crossbones 322. And we know that those kind of Illuminati factions love to work with the date. And we see an awful lot spinning out of control on a day like today. And it's interesting, too, because one of the other things that came up was this terrible bill that got passed miraculously through Congress with all 110 Republicans and all the Democrats supporting this $1.2 trillion funding bill, which is extraordinary for the amount of waste that's in the bill, but also that the Republicans were supposed to be standing up against all this nonsense, paying for other countries' borders, but not ours. There's no money in there for the border at all, which is insane. Just recently, we had that incredible breach at the Texas border with the Texas National Guard in the fight for their lives there. So this becomes a very heavy thing. And when I was looking at it, I was thinking to myself, this reminds me, if you go through history, of one of those turning point events. And I think the Tet Offensive was that during the Vietnam War, and some of the protest movements have had these moments. But that was such a shift, and for everyone, that little piece of video is going to go viral everywhere to see. It gets you right to the heart of it, which is this invading group, which is all men, fighting age men invading the country, and the National Guard under orders not to shoot them. And it's very interesting because I want to tell you something just as a personal anecdote that my whole life, for example, when I was a teenager, all the jobs and everything that I had, I worked with immigrants and people who are undocumented, illegal, and all the rest of it through all those different jobs. And I remember them quite well, whether it was people from Morocco or people from Ireland or people from Europe, whatever it happened to be, people from Africa. And I think the idea of people coming here to work and to establish a better life is the heart of the American dream. That's not the issue. The issue is the organization and invasion, which is a very different than any kind of xenophobia or anything like that. So right now, what we need is a very strong, almost nationalist approach to this, because there's no way the country can sustain it. And anyone who's telling you different is not being honest with you. But of course, if you don't have a border, you don't have a country. So we need to be able to separate it, though, and be able to speak very frankly about it, to say that, we appreciate everyone from every country. And of course, it's one global civilization. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But in terms of the country in the United States of America, we cannot sustain this avalanche of this invasion at the border. And it's already cost the American people $400 billion. So, and here in Massachusetts, they have this huge program where they're taking over civic centers and all this other stuff. And, of course, the politicians also use the immigrants for grandstanding and all the rest of it. What you need fundamentally at the heart of it is to stop the invasion at the border. Whichever presidential candidate will do that, and I know it's popular throughout the alternative media to say, oh, the presidential elections don't matter and all the rest. And I understand the cynicism. Plus me, I study the deep state about as much as anyone I can think of. However, it's going to make a very huge difference who's in office, because whoever it is that will stop the invasion at the border, that's the person who's going to be upholding the Constitution. The current president will not, and he's not providing for the common defense in that sense. And that's an impeachable offense. So Stepford Biden being given orders and, run by walkie-talkie and the little voices in his ear. And, it's interesting. A weird thing came up, just as a little aside, but, when I was listening to I went back and listened to a 1988 talk show, and they were talking about Biden and the aneurysm that he had in his head and how they had to install a metal piece in there in order to kind of keep him alive. And then I started to think about the incredible advances that they were talking about, with Elon Musk and his brain chips and all the rest of it. And this is how they roll this out in culture. And it's part of the transhumanism kick to be like, enhance yourself, put this chip in your brain. And in the meantime, they get all this information about, the pituitary and the pineal gland and all the rest. It's definitely a bridge too far. But I started to wonder about Biden and thinking if he wasn't an early recipient of a brain chip, and how convenient.
Whoa.
To think about the Manchurian Candidate action. Now, over here at MIT, which is maybe about 10 minutes from here, they had experiments around the time that Biden left office as vice president with a drug called Storm, which was supposed to help Alzheimer's patients come back and be forceful. And they were saying that a number of high-level people were trying it out on an experimental basis. And I believe that they were giving that drug to Biden in order to get through the 2020 election. So, I think that's the nature of the situation that we're in, that the person who is in charge there is just a figurehead and needs to be replaced. And we have the forces on one side, the Bobby Kennedy force of the independent campaign, and President Trump's surging campaign. And certainly the images at the border are helping him dramatically. It's interesting to me, Bobby Kennedy is going to announce his vice presidential choice on Tuesday, which is March 26th. And this is a make or break moment, because the people that have been floated out there, including this attorney Shanahan, who is the ex-wife of the founder of Google. That won't fly. So how those rumors got started, they're pretty substantial. And so if Bobby takes that kind of a turn, it's going to be an off-ramp to nowhere as far as the campaign goes. But hopefully, fingers crossed, he has the ability to change that direction. So whoever was giving that advice, maybe there's some shuffle that's going on there. But it's going to happen in Oakland, which is also not such a great sign because the figure, Attorney Shanahan, she is in fact from Oakland. So
It's
it
a
lends
done
itself.
deal. Come
Well,
on.
it lends itself. We don't know until it happens, but certainly it was not smart to let it ring out there. In the meantime, Tulsi Gabbard hopped on the Trump train.
Mhm.
That's pretty interesting. Something remarkable happened this week. Before I say what it is,
One thing.
before I say what it is, tell me how's the temperature out there?
Temperature's great. People are very enthusiastic. It's a big crowd tonight. I did want to mention Accidental Awakening said, please thank DJ for reading my email regarding Trump and AUTEC last week.
Oh, fantastic. What an incredible, thank you for sending it, because that connection with Trump and AUTEC is interesting. And, bringing it home to the point that AUTEC was allowing Trump's plane to park there at AUTEC in the parking lot off the coast of Florida, I think it does have a significance, especially since it's a regular occurrence, apparently. And Trump seems to be very deep in the exotic technology wing of all this. And you bet your life that AUTEC right there, sitting there, is the underwater Area 51 in the hot zone, in the work that we've done around the hot zone, which, is that area off the coast of Florida between the western tip of Cuba, Bimini. And Bimini comes up tonight also in the George Filer section. It's going to be very interesting to combine the COG NORAD with Bimini. How are you going to like that one? But also off the coast of Yucatan, the Yucatan Peninsula, that whole area, as we've outlined in a number of episodes, is the hot zone area, and it has a number of artifacts, which I've had a number of people who've worked in government programs, who've worked for companies who scan the ocean floor, do other things like look for energy, who've told me that they have to sign various types of non-disclosure agreements if they see ruins down there. And that's where the whole hot zone thing come from. We've been doing reports on the hot zone for 6 years. On May 3rd, now save the date, I'm doing a very special presentation, The Craze in the Hot Zone. This is Atlantis there in the Bahamas, and you're going to want to save that date. It's a 2-hour presentation. Nothing's going to beat that we've put together so far, and we're going to work hard on it for you. So May 3rd, Friday, May 3rd, the first Friday in May, that's a date to save as well. Okay, so now to the weird thing that happened this week.
Okay, let's hear it.
Before we go any further, everyone, I want to mention, if you're new here, especially, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch. And it gets us around this incredible censorship that we've been seeing. And it also lets you know the incredible shows and interviews. I mean, powerful interviews coming up, powerful X-Series episodes, and this exciting documentary May 3rd, plus events coming up this year. It's all there in the newsletter. Stand up and be counted. Make sure that you have the newsletter. If you like it, make sure it comes your way. And the only way to keep us in touch, because around social media, I think that because of the type of reporting we do, we're one of the most censored around, but so is a lot of the material that I enjoy. And I'm not big at playing the victim card on these types of things. I will go through any different type of channel to get the work out there. But just so you know, that's the best way for us to have that direct pipeline. So sign up for the newsletter and don't wait. Just make sure you do that right at darkjournalist.com. All right. So sometimes, you work and you work and you work on something, and then it falls into your lap. So the Melon Fraud, first of all, by the UFO obsters, got unraveled this week, and it unraveled on the weight of its own, lies. Now, it's interesting. There's a history there. I know a lot of people jump up and are saying, like, oh, hey, I used to out the Elizondo thing here and there, a lot of people who were behind the Elizondo thing, they got a lot of the UFO community on their side. And it was through the figure of Christopher Mellon, who's a former DOD official, part of the Mellon banking family, and, at times called the mayor of Area 51 because he was the guy who would go there and check it out and give him a clean report card and all the rest. Very early on, he was sucked in to that machine. And we know a great deal about him and the things that he's tried to do to launch this false CIA UFO threat. And so we started putting this on the record as soon as it came out, and all the contradictions and all the rest of it. And little by little, some researchers came on board and getting some major pieces of the puzzle out there. Now, fully discredited, Elizondo, the claims of TTSA, the claims of the New York Times article, all that stuff, the Tic Tac video, the whole mess, which was all part of a threat narrative op, which they try to mutate at different times. But the key figure behind it was Mellon, and this was something that was missing, I think, from everyone's vocabulary around this, and it's something that we tried very hard to put on the record. So this culminated when I talked to David Grush, the UFO whistleblower, as it were, and it's interesting because he comes up tonight because of a few comments that we had back and forth relating to the continuity of government program. But what I discovered when I was talking with him was that Mellon had the golden leash there, and he was saying to me, I've been influenced by your work, but I can't appear with you because Mellon would get angry. So this was interesting to me on a few levels because I've always known that Mellon was there. I always wondered who Mellon answered to as well. But something really kind of major, two things around the Mellon op that made the whole thing fall apart. And I think it's a huge moment. Then we have to really take a look at this. And it relates directly to this entire story of the secret system that's running the UFO file. So Mellon, as you may recall, claimed to be this kind of person who was helping things along, all the rest, just wanted that UFO disclosure. By the way, in 2016, he said there were no UFOs, and the government wasn't hiding anything at Area 51 or anywhere else. But in 2017, he changed. It's very interesting with Mellon because the people, I think, that were controlling him weren't sure when to launch him. But once they did, they launched him to save the sputtering TTSA Elizondo operation. Now, a big report came out of AARO, which was the phony UFO defense office that Marco Rubio put together with Kirsten Gillibrand, Senator Gillibrand out of New York. And they put together a big report with Sean Kirkpatrick saying, like the UFO thing, it wasn't, we couldn't find any evidence and all the rest of it. And this was part of giving them the ability to search for few records for defense contractors for little things that might be hanging out there. So Gizmodo, which is one of these tech blogs, which I knew well back in the days when I ran a tech magazine, said another UFO report is a bust. Why do many people still believe the truth is out there? In this article, Christopher Mellon gives an interview, and this is on the record now. This is Mellon himself talking. All the people who supported Mellon and said he was being unfairly maligned and all this other nonsense, all that whole UFO, about 99% of the UFO field, and the nonsense they bought into, including the top figures, as I mentioned before, like Nick Pope and Dolan and George Knapp. All those people bought in and supported and promoted all of these CIA people to their audiences, which was a terrible idea. And right now I'm going to prove why, based on Mellon's own comments. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Watch this for the TKO. Now, this is Gizmodo. As it stands today, so much of the UFO story revolves around the premise of information, good information and bad information, credible information and incredible information. One influential figure who at many times has played a prominent role in helping deliver information about the UFO subject to the broader public is Christopher Mellon, formerly highly placed U.S. intelligence official. For my money, he's still a highly placed intelligence official. Mellon gives off the impression that he knows where the government's bodies are buried. Yeah, you bet. Born into a wealthy family, Mellon was educated at Yale, 322, and worked for the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee for decades before transitioning into the intelligence community. He was known as the mayor of Area 51, by the way, as I stated earlier. When I did my own research on him, it went much deeper than any New York Times bio or anything like that. This guy was the one that they sent in to give a clean bill of health to these different secret bases so that they could continue their work. So in other words, he was able to hoard that and protect those guys over 2 decades in government. So he was at Yale. All right. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence for both the Clinton and Bush administration. As part of his work in government, Melon was part of a committee that was given oversight of all the Department of Defense Special Access Programs, or SAPs. Compartmentalized initiatives that are shrouded in secrecy. As such, you'd think that Melon would be the perfect person. For the better part of the last decade, Melon has used his government bona fides to advocate for transparency surrounding the UFO issue. Now, as I said, in 2016, he said the government wasn't hiding anything. 2017, he changed, launched with Elizondo and the whole bogus arrangement with Tom DeLonge and all the rest. When I spoke with Melon, he portrayed himself as a kind of bureaucratic truth seeker, a government insider who nevertheless has been flummoxed by the government's inaction on the issue of UFOs. As such, Melon says he's played an influential role in bringing the issue to the media and Congress, and as a result, into the wider public consciousness. Here we go. Are you ready? Melon says that after learning of the extent of UFO sightings by U.S. pilots, he wanted to spread the word about the issue. I came up with a simple plan to do that, which involved going to the press and going to Congress, said Melon. He then relays to me a familiar tale that it's made its ways into numerous reports, the whole tic-tac nonsense and all the rest of it. The way Melon explains it, the pivotal New York Times story that is largely credited with legitimizing UFOs within the broader culture never would have happened without his direct involvement. Quote, "This was not investigative journalism," Melon tells me. Quote, "I handed them the evidence, introduced them to Lou Elizondo, gave them a stack of documents, arranged for them to meet and interview Harry Reid, and made a deal with them." Okay, now let me tell you something. When you are in newsrooms, and I've worked in some of these newsrooms, if somebody says, "I'm going to make a deal with you to get this story out," it is, the extent of basically perpetrating a crime on the public, because you don't make deals for a story. So he arranged for them to meet and interview Harry Reid and made a deal with them. They ran the story, which would appear on December 16th of 2017 on the front page. Melon says this was part of a broader plan on his part to spread the word about UFOs and get Congress to take action on the matter. So the whole thing, the whole fraud, as we pointed out in the article, which was loaded with fraudulent statements, and it was perpetrated by Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal, that whole thing all came from Melon and his weird plan to launch this CIA UFO threat. Now, the threat piece, a number of people who were around the UFO thing, when I pointed out that the whole thing was about a threat, the UFO community, their whole response was, "Oh, no, it's not a threat. These CIA people are good." And you had guys, unfortunately, as I mentioned, like Dolan and Knapp and, a number of other people saying they're part of a heroic faction. Since one of the CIA heroes? I don't think so. Now, in the same week, this is 2 days before this huge admission in Gizmodo, a Grant Cameron interview on this vetted podcast. Here's the headline. Grant Cameron says Chris Mellon pulled out of Canadian UFO disclosure. Quote, this is Grant Cameron, the UFO researcher, who's been on this program before. "It was Mellon, as soon as he heard that the Canadians weren't going to do the UFO threat thing. They were going to do a scientific investigation of UFOs," he said. "That's the poison pill," Mellon said. "I'm gone." So no threat, no research, no funding, and all the rest of it, no cooperation, no statements, no nothing. As soon as that Canadian government said, "We want to take a scientific approach to this thing," Mellon said, "If you're not going to use the UFO threat, then forget it. I'm out of here. I'm not going to waste my time," because his instructions are to launch a UFO threat. He gets those instructions from the people inside the intel community, based directly in the Central Intelligence Agency. He rolls it out. He's got the money. He's got the connections. He rolls out the whistleblowers. That's where we get all the phony hearings in Congress. This is the nature of the UFO threat that the CIA launched on us in 2017. They've been doing it for a long time behind the scenes, but this was their moment to hit. Now it's on the record. It's indisputable. And those UFO researchers who said there is no threat, anyone who goes after them just is attacking disclosure and all the rest of it. No, it's on the record now. It's sort of undeniable. It's almost like the guy confessed to the crime. So there is no more discussion about it. They launched the op. The question now is, why did the CIA launch the UFO threat op? And that gets us directly to the continuity of government, COG, end of this topic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Deep State in Space, COG UFO file revealed, and the filer revealed. Whew, George Filer. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. But wow, Miss Olivia, it's amazing, isn't it? Because it comes down to when you do the research and you put it out there and then you wait, you just, it'll come around and here, boom, the entire thing validated all the research that we did putting out the UFO thread, and it comes directly out of Melon's mouth, which I thought was quite remarkable. But what's also interesting is, and a number of people have picked up on this, is that he's saying, well, I use Melon and, I use Leslie Kane and I use Blumenthal as little puppets on a string. And he's describing the whole thing as, he's like, they weren't doing journalism. I gave them the whole thing. I told them what to say. Well, that's not journalism. That is the control of a bureaucrat deep inside a secret intel system, giving them what to say about UFOs. And it's quite interesting because I was reading an interview by Leslie Kane. They were interviewing her about how she got into UFOs. She goes through this whole thing and doesn't mention Bud Hopkins. Again, I keep waiting for it. Look, Bud Hopkins was her life partner. They lived together. He did all of the breakthrough abduction research. He was a gold mine of intel around this. She doesn't even mention that. So that's a huge red flag. And the fact that she doesn't get called out on that and does these Netflix specials and all the rest of it. Look, that is the whole controlled op aspect of this. It has to be brought to the fore, and we have to think of the real fork in the road as UFO file research versus the CIA UFO circus. But now Melon is on the record, and thank God Grant Cameron came out and said, well, the Canadian government thing, the reason that got, because everyone was talking about this about 2 years ago, and it was Melon and Elizondo and all these people that were going to work to bring transparency in the Canadian government around UFOs. But no, as soon as the Canadians said, we don't want the threat aspect involved in there, Melon pulled out. Melon said, well, if there's no threat, that's a poison pill and I'm out of here. That tells you everything you need to know about that op. The danger is, the kind of money and influence and intel connections that this guy has in the UFO field and the puppeteering of the whistleblower Grush and all the rest of it. That stuff needs to be called out across the board. And now it is confessed on record at Gizmodo, Melon himself doing it. So, I rest my case on that one. And, it's funny because you're going to notice that all the way back in 2018, I did a show with Gigi Young, actually, when we went through the entire thing of the fraud around the New York Times article. And, it's taken 5 years to roll around, but there it is in its glory. Now, I'll tell you what's fascinating about all this and the timing around it, which is I have long suspected that Christopher Melon was associated directly with the continuity of government program based on his various assignments. And I've also looked deeply into the crisscross of the UFO file with the continuity of government program. Those two things are going to come in very important tonight. As I said, tonight we're doing a short report. This is just going to run about 90 minutes, but this whole theme is going to spill out into everything that's going on with election 2024, because I think COG and the UFO file are both going to be right under our nose for this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, Deep State in Space, the COG UFO file revealed. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Joseph Tugas says, wow, definitely not investigative journalism, public relations at best. Melon knows most journalists are lazy and like to be spoon-fed. The All Music official YouTube channel says, everything is a rich man's trick. The end. And Ray Story says, I think you broke him, DJ.
Isn't it interesting? Well, we knew that when the clash happened with Melon and he flipped out online and he made all these weird accusations about me out of nowhere. I mean, it's like, this was fascinating because, here's Melon in his ivory tower. He doesn't have to say anything. And the fact that he did meant that we had touched a nerve, but we had touched it through the figure of Grush. And, in this over 3 hours with Grush back in December, when we had that conversation, and I think there's a couple of crucial things that are in that talk. But one of the things that I put on the record about it was his fear, his literal, palpable fear of Melon, backlash from Melon. He was just trying to be matter of fact about it and tell me. And I thought about that and I thought, well, this is interesting because Melon having that much control over Grush, who said he was rolling over the tables for UFO disclosure and all the rest of it, there was too much. It's kind of sank in after a little while. It was too much of a contradiction for him to be claiming to do this. And then about 4 days after my conversation with him, he showed up at this Wall Street soiree. And what I was told by a person who was there was that there was $400 billion in the room in terms of the groups that were there. And the rest of the people were CIA and Homeland Security people. So the nature of the launch of this becomes very important. Now, launch is a very key word that we're going to go into the next section with. And before I go any further, I want to remind everyone, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com. I'm going to hit on this newsletter thing because people are often telling me they don't get notifications from YouTube and all the rest of it. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for that newsletter. That newsletter is your key pipeline directly to us and gets around all the censorship. The other thing I want to say is that we have some very exciting announcements coming up that will be first in that newsletter. And since it's free, stand up and be counted. Make sure you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter to make sure that you're on board with all the incredible things coming up, including our Hot Zone event, The Craze in the Hot Zone, 2-hour presentation on May 3rd. And you bet I pulled out all the stops. And, we've been doing a lot of that lately, like we did with Blue Enigma. And the APOTHEUM documentary, this one is really going to take you. We'll take you there on that one. What else you got there before I launch?
I love this quote. I think I'm going to make this quote of the night from Ray J. Activist journalism talks about answers that can't be questioned, not questions that are hard to answer.
Exactly. Well, we've had a lot of examples lately. It's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because something came out in the New York Times. This is hilarious. And it's so Orwellian that I was blown away. It's great. The follow-up video, when I watched it, was also hilarious, but a number of people had a laugh at this. This is the headline. This is an actual headline in the New York Times. It turns out that the deep state is actually kind of awesome. It's awesome, because it's awesome to take over countries and assassinate people and, deprive individuals of their rights because it's awesome. This is the nature of the kind of psychosis. And I'm thinking, well, we can play anything, we can play reverse psychology basically on anything. And the video itself, it's such a parody that you think you're watching comedy, and they go hang out with people who are supposed to be deep staters, like you're an analyst at the CIA, and they get these kind of normal people and who have nothing to do with the deep state. And they're like, the deep state is just like us. Hey, you like to party, listening to Taylor Swift and all this stuff. I mean, it's really that bad. But this is remarkable to me because it sort of sounds the depths that they know that there's no going back, that the public on one level understands it. And the only thing they can do is continue to deflect and somehow to take the fact that the public, say, has become aware of the deep state, which was popularized really in the 1990s by Professor Peter Dale Scott, and had really to do with his research around the renaissance of interest in the JFK assassination. But he got into cocaine politics, he got into 9/11 and all the rest of it. And it's interesting, after a period of time, a couple of decades here, they're just like, this deep state thing isn't going away. What are we going to do with it? We're going to make the deep state good. Hey, they're nice guys. They like Taylor Swift. the guy's like, I need to rush back and buy my wife a rug, So it's one of the worst videos you've ever seen in your life. Now, in the middle of all this, of course, we we have to say that with striking a nerve around this, the UFO aspect, the UFO file, is a crucial thing that's also come to light that they also need to spin. And what we've been watching is them promoting a false version of UFO disclosure. Now, the question is, what happens to the real thing and the real research? What is the real thing that's going on there in the background? And, whether you go back to the airship mystery of the 19th century or you go all the way back to some of these earlier sightings, in the Casey readings, things about Atlantean aircraft zooming around and causing incidents like the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, you can see that we've been operating here with something else and some other technology. So the question becomes, is this something that has been here with us the whole time? Is it an aspect of ancient human technology involved with the creation of Atlantis? Or are we looking at something which is off-world civilizations visiting? And, is it advanced technology here or it's something here from somewhere else? It's very interesting because you can get to a point with the UFO file when looking into it where you can say either extraterritorial or extraterrestrial. In a sense, it almost doesn't matter because what's happening in the middle is the government effort to obfuscate all the facts involving it, including from an occult perspective. And that's the most interesting to me because when you get around the psychic aspect relating to the UFO file, you're getting close. That's what I've noticed in the research itself. So that suggests there's a much bigger picture involved here, including the idea of recruiting psychics, as we covered in 2 episodes ago about the NASA psychics part. So tonight gets us around that. And it's interesting because George Filer gets us into continuity of government and the alien aspect as well. I'm going to say this about Filer, which is that he released a book back in 2019, and the UFO crowd really avoided this guy, but he had impeccable credentials, and his story was quite remarkable and took us all the way back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the UFO surveillance going on during that whole thing, because they were really riveted about anything that might be going on in the sky at that point. What came out was that when his book hit in late 2019, there was one story in there about an alien that had been killed while in the custody of the American military, and the big headline was a space alien shot and killed in Burlington County. That is George Filer III, who is the Air Force major in question. I'm going to go into his story and some of the gems that are in his book that were left there on the cutting room floor by the UFO field because they weren't particularly interested in the real thing. They wanted to promote Elizondo and all that nonsense. And the word was that what they needed to do was talk about a UFO threat and not identify anything to do with beings. That's another shot of Filer there around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, working closely, getting images to Curtis LeMay about the Soviet nuclear buildup in Cuba. So the reason that this is going to be so fascinating, I'm going to give away the end in advance, is that MacDill Air Force Base is where the new continuity of government commander came out of. That is the realm he came out of. The huge UFO overlap to MacDill is almost just as big or larger a signature as it was for the previous NORTHCOM commander who came out of the 509th, which, if you trace that back, is the same group that scooped up the Roswell wreckage in the first place. So there's something about the COG commanders and the Space Force commanders that keep having this identifying signature of dealing directly with the UFO file lineage in some fashion. Van Herk resigned his commission as NORTHCOM COG commander on February 4th. And we have a new one now. And I'm going to get into him tonight. But General Gillett And this guy is going to be now the combatant commander of the United States in the event of an emergency. This guy would take over. He'd be the president and the defense secretary combined into one office. And this is the way that the continuity of government program works. We've covered continuity of government in the deep state on this program extensively. I still think it's one of the least covered aspects of our government ever. And thank God we have the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott, who gave us such an insight into this program and told me through our many interviews that the continuity of government COG program was the least understood and had the least oversight of anything going on in the government. Now, it had been put in place with massive underground bunkers, massive underground infrastructure, starting in the 1940s, supposedly. That planning probably goes back even further, but certainly since directly after World War II. And its ostensible purpose was in the event of a nuclear strike, in the decapitation of the government, you would have this other functioning government ready to go. And it was parodied in things like Dr. Strangelove and all the rest, and parodied in a darker way in movies like 7 Days in May, where the COG commander is trying to overthrow the president and launch missiles against Russia. So this has been kind of buried there in the public consciousness, but it's been built up and built up. And what Professor Scott noticed was the oversight became less and less and less and less. Now, another interesting factor in all this is in our background as a country, in America, we have a number of deep events. And the deep events are different things where it seems now that a covert system of government comes into the public, causes a policy change, and then retreats back into the shadows. That first deep state revolt was against the White House happened in the Kennedy assassination. We moved through the Vietnam War, Watergate, and a number of things that take place. The October surprise in relation to the 1980 election, the Iran, and also, Iran-Contra, and of course, 9/11, the 2008 economic coup, financial coup in the United States, and certainly the COVID thing. All of these represent different various deep events. And what's interesting is in Professor Scott's work, he tracks the COG personnel operational between the Kennedy assassination and the 9/11 event. Now, it's very interesting because the patterns that are operated, it seems that in all of these deep events, everyone who came out of the continuity of government planning office and planning details, out of that infrastructure of this incredible underground world that we know nothing about, they were all involved in one way or another with each one of these deep events. And although Professor Scott's work doesn't get into the UFO file, and as I've said before, the big problem that we have is that the deep state researchers, who are much better than UFO researchers, don't get into the UFO file. And the only advantage that the UFO researchers have is that they know there's a UFO file, but you cannot get those groups to crisscross. And so what's happening is when you look at it, though, on the UFO file through the deep state lens, and then add the continuity of government program, all of these pieces come together. And I want to say that when I pointed this out to Grush in our phone call, he said that he had found in an extraordinary basis that they were the most unhelpful, as it were. And he very much agreed with my portrayal of the continuity of government. And he felt that, the way that they were operating on the secret basis was the same as the UFO file. Now, whether he said that just for my benefit or not, I just think it's an interesting aside as we get in here, because if we want to really penetrate the nature of the problem, and this goes directly to the nature of the problem with Russia and America also, it happens to do with these structures that don't have any oversight. So the continuity of government program and the UFO file are twins in that aspect because they both operate there. And what do you get if you combine the two? You get that secret space program apparatus, because all you have to do is take all those things that you've applied on a legal basis underground to say, well, we can do all this stuff because of national security. You just flip all that underground infrastructure into space. You build up a massive infrastructure in space and say that's all secret. In between, you have the public civilization trying to operate and figure out what's going on between these massive block on top in space that's operating secretly and the massive block operating underground. And there's a lot of infrastructure involved. There's a lot of production involved. And there's a lot of figures involved who dance between the public domain and people we've never, ever heard of. One of the people in the heart of this that Professor Scott identified, of course, was Dick Cheney, the former vice president and also congressman, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he goes all the way back. Remember, he was involved in the Ford administration, and he and Rumsfeld, operated with chief of staff and very high levels there. They were the ones who President Reagan called in the 1980s to develop a much deeper version of continuity of government than the one that we had. And the key change, there's two main changes to the continuity of government program. One of them is in 1988, when it changes from being just a nuclear emergency to an emergency. So any emergency, COVID, the UFO file, the UFO threat, whatever it would happen to be, that would grant them emergency powers. In 2007 and 2008, Bush understood and undertook a number of unusual moves in relation to that UFO file aspect. And he changed a number of the emergency provisions to give them much more easier access to hide their tracks. Now, there's been a shift in the whole COG nature of the culture as well. Before, like in the 80s and 90s, you could never mention it, not even on television. When it was brought up accidentally during a hearing in 9/11, all the lawyers flipped out and all the congressmen flipped out and said, you can't talk about that. There's one article about it in 1986 that brought it to the fore. Then sometime around the Trump presidency, and, all along, Professor Scott's been putting out information about COG. During the Trump presidency, suddenly it gets brought up on a very casual basis through the media. And Nancy Pelosi starts talking about being briefed by COG when they never, ever even used to mention it. So getting close to, using it, as it were, they started to say, hey, we need to talk about this thing. Pelosi in particular started to raise it when President Trump got COVID going into the last stage of the 2020 election. Certainly one of the plans that they had for the 2020 election was to have, just announce COG, get Trump out of there because he had COVID, and say, we have COG through Terrence O'Shaughnessy. Now, what didn't happen there, though, is part of why you see all these strange shakeups that happen at the end of the Trump administration, where he's firing the defense secretary. Well, it's a weird thing to do because the guy only had 2 months left anyway. And he's firing this person, firing that person, and making all these gigantic moves, probably more moves than any president has made behind the scenes, including enacting the National Security Action Memorandum 57, which was President Kennedy's national NSAM, saying, look, we need to remove the Central Intelligence Agency from all paramilitary operations and return it to the Joint Chiefs. Well, he activates it. I'm sure the Biden administration got rid of it as soon as they got in. But all these unusual moves relate directly to the secret kind of tennis match that's been going on. I guess it's more like a fencing game going on, and highly dangerous and highly secret game going on deep, deep in the government. So this is the continuity of government program. I want to read a couple of quick quotes from Professor Scott in relation to this. Then we're going to get into George Filer and how his story relates directly to this COG UFO crossover. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a great night for us to get in here and talk about these things. It's a huge crowd there in the Ideas Room. Great to see everyone. And tonight is Deep State in Space, the COG UFO file revealed. And how does that UFO aspect relate directly in here? We're going to tell you. And we've had the trappings of seeing the UFO threat op in the beginning here unravel through the confessions of DoD official Christopher Mellon. What does that tell us about what they're planning for this stage? That's the question. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Joseph Farrell is in the chat, and he says, DJ, do you think that fencing match that you referred to, re Trump Pelosi, is still going on?
Excellent question. It's good to see him out there. Look, what's interesting to me is their worst nightmare is Trump coming back. And their worst nightmare is when he was in. Now their worst nightmare is him coming back. And the fact that they have Pelosi and Hillary out there, and both of them out of office as just pundits trying to, somehow poke holes in this guy. And after really taking every shot that possibly could be imagined legally through the media and all the rest of it, still more than 50% of the country wants him as president over insane leader that we have now. Now, wherever you fall politically, you have to understand there is no one in that political circle who's ever been the subject of that kind of animus. And the deep state side, the reason that you have to peel them off the ceiling at the very mention, you can see this with John Brennan, Pelosi, and others. But when they hear the word Trump, they hit the ceiling and they're losing it, because in that structure, for them to sit across the table with somebody who understands the UFO file as well as they do, and who has access to that through his family and through John Trump, and understands X technology through John Trump's work with Tesla, it is at the very heart of the problem that they have with Trump. And it's the same problem that they have with the public when the public gets around this. That's the nature of the whole X-Protect thing, keeping the UFO file secret. And I have to bring up, of course, that it's Roy Cohn that showed and was the guide for Trump to where all the deep state dead bodies were buried. So they know Trump is a double threat in dealing with him. And Trump is like, look, I can do what I want, but I'll make deals with you on this and that. And they just want him to go away, because he is their nightmare combined. I'm not even mentioning the fact that he developed this very close relationship that we put on the record with President Richard Nixon, even set up his office in New York in the 80s. And Nixon, of course, originally the idea was Nixon wrote him one letter and he said, I predict you're going to be president. What's interesting is I unravel that there was a much deeper communication that went on over a decade, and that in terms of letters, you'd have much more back and forth. Well, out of nowhere, the Nixon Museum came out a couple of years later and said, yeah, actually, we have 200 or 300 letters between these guys. The relationship was much deeper than previously understood. When you follow that track initiative, what I call extegonography, what any researcher would call just getting deeper on these things, you can blow past any of the restrictions that you have in the traditional understanding of who these people are. And I think that Trump with Nixon is very important, because Nixon understood, this aspect. And he also understood the UFO file aspect in relation to the deep state. So Roy Cohn does, Nixon does, and John Trump being directly in the family and telling him, look, I actually have a shot here of Vannevar Bush, and it's interesting because the one thing that has to be considered when you talk about Trump, this is John Trump's mentor, Vannevar Bush, and Vannevar Bush ran the UFO file for 2 decades. So how much did John Trump know? He knew everything there was to know, and that's why he got sent in on the Tesla thing. So yeah, the minute you mention Trump, forget it. You're in deep. Okay, a couple of quick things.
Wait, hold on. Joseph has a follow-up question.
Yes.
He says, okay, how would you characterize that problem that they have with Trump?
Oh, it's an information problem. What they have with Trump is someone who has that knowledge base. So I guess what I just said answered that question, which is, this is the nature of the problem, which is they're sitting across the table from him and they're saying he has the same level of knowledge as we do. 1, 2, he has access to this. 3, he might go off with something like Space Force and abscond the UFO file back underneath the executive branch. That would be a nightmare for them. And in fact, I think that's what they're most worried about.
David
Yeah.
John Moan says they badly want to know how to control what they cannot.
Yeah, that's really true. All right. So what we'll do is we'll go for about another half hour on this and we'll take your questions.
Okay.
Terrific. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X-Series special report for you tonight. Deep State in Space, COG UFO File revealed. We're taking your questions shortly here. I'm going to get into some quotes about deep events in COG from Professor Scott himself. Professor Scott, I highly recommend his work. I talk about him a lot in relation to the UFO file. He doesn't have anything to do with the UFO file. He's a UC Berkeley professor out there on the left coast, and back in the good old days would have been associated with leftist causes, no question about it. And his remarkable work dissecting the deep state stands apart from anybody. And it's interesting because when I was reading Seymour Hersh's work and the salacious book that he did on the Kennedys, which has one amazing gem in it that I'm going to bring out tonight, I was thinking to myself, Professor Scott would never waste his time with this whole thing about, what sex position the Kennedy liked to, stuff, part of the deep state research piece, when you get to someone like Seymour Hersh, you can tell he's being fed things that are going to be kind of spit out through that National Enquirer or grapevine in the 1990s. And so he did so much that was, I think, healthy in the 70s and 80s to expose the deep state. But at a certain point, and this is something that Professor Scott mentioned to me, that Seymour Hersh got turned and the CIA people started to come to him and say, look, we'll give you the details around these things. Just let us be the pipeline. Don't guess yourself. And this is the nature of the problem. And that's why that book, The Dark Side of Camelot, is loaded with so much salacious trash. But nonetheless, there's still a couple of very key points in there. On the other side is the very serious Professor Scott. And Professor Scott, the books I would recommend, American Deep State, absolutely crucial. The War Machine, Dallas 63, the first deep state revolt against the White House, and Kennedy and Deep Politics. All the deep state aspect draws directly back to Professor Scott. Here's what he had to say about deep events and how they affect American culture. And let's remember this in the context of the UFO file as well, although he's speaking about national security issues. Since writing these chapters, I've come more and more to analyze recent American history in the light of what I call structural deep events, like the JFK assassination, the Watergate break-in, Iran-Contra, or 9/11, which repeatedly involve law-breaking or violence. They're mysterious to begin with and are embedded in ongoing covert processes. It sounds pretty familiar in 2024. Have political consequences that enlarge covert governments and are subsequently covered up by systematic falsifications in the mainstream media and internal government records. The more I study these deep events, the more I see suggestive similarities between them, increasing the possibility that they are not unrelated external intrusions into American history, but parts of an endemic process, sharing to some degree or other elements from a common source. For example, one factor linking Dallas in 1963, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and 9/11 has been the involvement in all four deep events of personnel involved in America's highest level emergency planning, known since the 1950s as the Continuity of Government COG planning, or more colloquially inside the Pentagon as the Doomsday Project. The reason it's known as the Doomsday Project is literally it's an infrastructure that is created to survive an emergency and start all over again. So the mindset that these people are in, just like the new general at NORTHCOM, who now takes over NORTHCOM and takes over NORAD and is the COG combatant commander, they've been trained that they need to lead civilization after, a dark age, basically. So there's been a nuclear event, there's been an emergency. So their whole training is all about surviving and the culture perishing, and they have to lead, a small band from these underground circles until humanity can bloom and blossom again. We have to kind of get inside their heads a little bit around this. They think of culture as disposable, something that can go at any minute, and they are, the line of protecting, consciousness and the future and all the rest. And it's interesting because a lot of the language that Elon Musk uses when he talks about preserving consciousness to Mars and the light of consciousness and all this nonsense that he pulls out, it's very interesting to me because I believe Musk is also in that continuity of government team. Now, it's interesting because if you go deep into continuity of government, you're going to find that in Eisenhower's era, it wasn't just military or political people that were in the COG structure. It was also, for example, the leader of CBS News. They had their own earmarked bunker, but they had access to them. And I've only spoken to one person who was in that underground structure, and they couldn't tell me much because they're under definite NDAs and things. But the sprawling nature of the development underground. So, for example, you'd go down and you'd go down and you'd go down, and underground, when you get to the bottom of that elevator, you step out and there's an entirely different culture down there, with malls and restaurants and houses and everything else. So we're already split off into this kind of bizarro nature. But that underground infrastructure has grown and grown and grown and grown. So we need to be aware of that we're talking about a parallel culture that's building up side by side with us. And the people who are keeping the secrecy around the continuity of government have abused that process of, hey, it's national security. We need to do this in case of an emergency. And so now they are beyond the sanction of the civilization, our society here, free society with its checks and balances and law. So the UFO group that is the mirror of this is the X-Protect group. And they're the same ones who've operated with a high level of technology. And what's going on there is they don't want to share that with the public and, how we developed it and all the rest of it. They just want to use it to their advantage and come in and paint a picture of what this is and design their different advantages out of it. They could create all kinds of different psyops in relation to it. An alien invasion, that would give them all the emergency powers they would need. They can hang out now like they do, guys like Trudeau and Biden at 25, 30% in the polls. It wouldn't matter. That's not enough to govern. But with emergency powers, it doesn't matter because they just keep going. You think Macron could win an election now in France? No way. So, we have to look at it from a practical point of view. When you get into X-Protect, you're looking at a group who's just protecting this incredible sprawling advantage from 8 decades of development. Now, and those are superficial figures, 8 decades. I believe the development goes much further back, but at least going from the 1940s on. The other thing that we see, and this is where the Melon aspect comes in and why I think Melon is also deeply associated with the COG group. Melon, in coming forward and talking about how he orchestrated all the monkey business with Elizondo and DeLong, everybody, he's saying that he was trying to get a story out about UFOs. And the story was a threat, which is why he didn't want to just do research in Canada, scientific research. He just wanted the threat thing. This is very important. And the UFO threat becomes the crucial aspect. It's the deep state's ultimate weapon, in my opinion. People talk about cyber attacks. We've had this whole, medical fascism piece with the COVID op. But the UFO file emergency is really out of this world. And they have, already done a dry run through the Chinese balloons and the phony shoot down things. And they keep rolling that. They keep playing with it. In the middle of all that, this new COG commander comes out, General Gillett, and he says, you know what? I was shocked to see the number of incursions by flying objects at the border. And they said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you're going to press me on it, I saw at least 1,000 incursions of unidentified objects over the border, which are somebody's aircraft that we don't know whose. Now, look, when you have a country, that is created out of a Cold War environment, all those defenses and all the rest of it, and have gone through 9/11 and all the rest of it. There's no way that 1,000 objects can just be hanging out there. In a normal situation in any other country, you would just shoot them down. You would get rid of them. But this is all part of the strange kind of way of dealing with these things that we hear going on in the public, and these kind of glib things that are going on when we hear these people interviewed. I'm going to go into Gillett briefly, and then we'll go back to Professor Scott, and then we'll take your questions. Everyone, you're watching the Deep State in Space, COG, UFO File Revealed Special X Series report here on the Dark Journalist Show. We'll be taking your questions with Miss Olivia here shortly. Before I go any further, what do you got?
We have someone very exciting in the
Yes.
ideas room. Her name is Heather Quinn. I worked for President Nixon at the White House in '72 as a crypto technician assigned to staff for communication support. How many of you know that Nixon had 3 time travel programs going on between '71 and '73 via SRI and NSA? Nixon was taken down by the COG team. There was a big turf war between CIA and NSA in 1973. Now COG is controlled by BlackRock and Vanguard. The cabal has brought many technologies from the future to the present in order to monetize it.
Isn't that interesting? Well, time travel comes up a lot, and I've pointed it out in relation to the Thomas Townsend Brown aspect, and something interesting happened there. And by the way, if Heather Quinn,
I already asked her.
Oh yeah, she
to
can
reach out to
email.
you.
She can email me at admin@darkjournalist.com, and I would love to hear more about Nixon's White House on that end of things. But Thomas Townsend Brown, it's very interesting because one of the aides who was working with him tells a story about him, musing about this time travel technology he was working on and saying, what do you think? Do you think it's possible? And that we'll see it in our lifetimes? And the aide says, well, I don't know. And, Thomas Townsend Brown asks him, what would you do, if you could? And he said, well, I'd save my sister who perished very young, And Brown turns to him and says, well, probably, in the nature of things that wouldn't be allowed. But I can tell you this, that we have the ability to do it. So he was on the record with that. And it's very interesting because in those deep programs, there's certainly something hardcore on the time aspects. Of course, a lot of junk gets thrown out about it as well, and a lot of counterfeit conspiracy. But that's just the nature of it. Okay. Russia warns a potential military strike on SpaceX satellites, a legitimate target for retaliatory measures, including military ones. Russia's accused the United States of using commercial satellite operators for its intelligence efforts. This is part of that perfect storm in space and the deep state actions going on, and is threatening to take military action in response. The news comes days after Reuters released a report earlier this month detailing a classified contract that SpaceX signed with a U.S. intelligence agency to launch hundreds of spy satellites. It does change what SpaceX is or claimed to be. So, it wasn't just a public thing. This is a military piece. And what I think that they've done here, looking at it with Musk is a space leader. This is how they're developing him. So, space president, whatever you want. And he is going to start to interact with different countries saying what I can do, the things I can provide you. And the cover that he's going to have is that he's operating in space. And that's, of course, there's no democratic control up there. There's no oversight, and it's outside of the realm of a number of our laws and all the rest of it. This is part of what they're trying to do to bend themselves out of the box of the Constitution and things like that in America, and rules and laws in other countries. Now, this program about space goes back some, and I'm going to walk us back there a little bit. Before I do that, I want to point out a couple of things. This is the new NORTHCOM commander, Gregory Gillett. And he's taken over now. This is the combatant commander of the United States. The minute they call a UFO threat emergency, cyber emergency, whatever, he's it. And he controls NORTHCOM, he controls COG, and he controls NORAD. So he really has control of the skies and things on the ground. He becomes the total leader of the United States in the event of an emergency. And he would appoint, technically the rules that they have in place, he would appoint regional governors until we could have an election again. Yeah, maybe never, right? Now, he's just doing his job, but COG, like NORTHCOM, is completely unconstitutional. NORTHCOM didn't exist until October of 2022, a year after 9/11. They created it. And before, we had a totally different thing. We never had the military running us. But NORTHCOM's instructions were, as part of the COG emergency planning that kicked in after they used COG during 9/11, was, well, you're going to basically take over in the event of an emergency. Now, it was interesting because they have a senator down there named Tuberville down in Alabama, and he held on this COG commander for a year and a half, so he could not be approved. And I had a feeling that Tuberville was waiting for Trump's pick and didn't want this guy in there as the COG commander. There was a very interesting thing there. They called it the military hold, and he was able to hold up a number of Biden's appointments. This was quite a lot of Senate maneuvering in the background. Now, this is from Gregory Gillett testifying before Congress, the COG commander. Upon taking command, I began a 90-day assessment to inform the Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, Congress, NORAD, and NORTHCOM's ability to execute assigned tasks and make recommendations on where commands could or should do more. Gillett said in his opening remarks, once complete, I look forward to sharing my findings and updated vision of how NORAD and NORTHCOM will best execute the noble mission of Homeland Defense. As part of my 90-day assessment, to tell the truth, the counter unscrewed aircraft systems mission has dominated that so far in the first month. Of course, I knew it was an issue coming in under another combatant command, CENTCOM, which is where he comes out of, where we faced a threat that was different in a different way because of the environment. The NORAD and NORTHCOM commanders said toward the end of the hearing, I wasn't prepared for the number of incursions that I see, that is, flying objects over the United States. I've gone into the events at Joint Base Langley and Eustis, and I'm using that as the centerpiece of my assessment. In response to queries from the War Zone, the shared Public Affairs Office for NORAD said the two commands were aware of the issues that General Gillett had referred to in his testimony. When pressed, the general said, when they said, how many incursions are we talking about over the border of the United States by unidentified craft, which, UFOs, drones, the whole gamut. And he said over 1,000, which is absurd. Now, it's just like the Chinese balloon thing. There are laws that govern how we do things since the Cold War, since World War II, and all the rest of it. I pointed out that during the Chinese balloon thing, we have laws in place about, because the Japanese during World War II used to send over poison bombs with balloons. So we have laws that you can't do that. Anything coming in gets shot down, and, tough luck, whatever it was. So there's no way that 1,000 flying objects would be coming over our border or whatever. It just wouldn't happen. So what he's already signing on to this, which means that whatever it is that they're planning is they're into the next stage of it, in my opinion. Amid Chinese activity, new NORTHCOM chief calls for more exercises near the Arctic. Something is going on there in relation to the continuity of government program with this new guy, and what he's pointing out, and the fact that he wants to, kind of build up our ability to shoot these things down, but he hasn't, and then he's creating this scenario where there's 1,000 objects in our airspace that shouldn't be there. So NORAD, and the whole reason it's created was as an early warning system in case something comes in from another country and there's a missile incoming in ICBM, you get time to either shoot it down or prepare people. So you watch it and nothing gets through there. So in the 1980s, if you go back and look at the testimony around some of the nuclear agreements they were trying to draw up in the Reagan administration, one of the points that Senator Ted Kennedy made was that the Russians had the ability to take pictures of the license plates of cars in underground parking garages in Washington, D.C. So that's what they had in the 1980s. There's no way to have 1,000 flying objects coming in undetected. So, and you would deal with them immediately. You'd shoot them down. So already you're getting a lot of mealy mouth stuff. And my impression is this is to warm us up to this UFO threat aspect in the sky. Couple of quick things here to point out, and then we'll finish our filer bio. Let's see how we're doing here on time. And then we'll take questions in like 15 minutes. How does that sound?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, Deep State in Space, COG, UFO File revealed. A lot of information to get through tonight in our special report, but we'll take you there on this one. And of course, the tremendous news of the Russian shooting, just unbelievable. Yeah, what do you got?
Sorry, I just read Happy Hermit 3D says, can you imagine how much Chris Mellon hates DJ?
Yeah, well, that's a change. I have to tell you, when it comes to the whole Melon thing, that this is somebody who really felt untouchable in relation to what he was up to, and the fact that we were on to him and a few other people were, and the fact that he wasn't able to, the fact that he was kind of looking at the situation with Grush and thinking that somehow he could control everything that Grush did. And apparently he is controlling Grush. But we got out that one little thing, is that one little conversation. And I think it irks Melon, because now the game is out. What do you do next? Roll this guy out before Congress? Well, I sent, how many people did I flag in Congress with our conversations around Melon? They're very aware that Melon is controlling Grush. So it spins that whole UFO thing very dramatically. I'm going to go back now to COG. Here we go. That, by the way, is Professor Scott. And as I said, he was the one who put the continuity of government on the map and what it could be used for, and including the fact that it has an emergency communications channel that cannot be tracked. And that made it invaluable during the Kennedy assassination. It made it invaluable during the Iran-Contra piece, because you can use it as a channel of communications and nobody can eavesdrop in on you. And using the emergency communications network, sometimes called the Doomsday Network, because it's supposed to secure communications in the event of a nuclear emergency. So obviously nothing's going to stop you there. But using it as camouflage while you are planning something that is illegal inside the government is the nature of the misuse of these systems, which were set up for something completely different. That's why they don't have the oversight. So the COG question is going to loom large with the UFO question, because they're both titans of secrecy. And we have to get, if we want to penetrate anywhere near the truth on these things, you have to get to the bottom of it in the continuity of government program and the UFO file. Now, there's a little piece back there that has to do with President Kennedy trying to get those very same answers. Kennedy's there. There's a couple of people with him that are interesting to point out. That is Richard Bissell, who they was the original mayor of Area 51. And this is Alan Dulles, who's the head of the CIA and just a titan of the deep state, whose brother was the Secretary of State for 9 years. And over there is John McCone, who JFK called a bastard. And McCone will take over for Dulles as soon as Kennedy gets rid of him. What's important about this picture, and the mayor of Area 51 there, Bissell, is a very imposing figure. He's 6'7". He has a very, very interesting career. He's also out of Yale, so another 322 shout out. And one of the things that he's involved with two things that are crucial to what we're talking about. One is the tracking of UFOs via satellite. One. 2, he's in charge of all of the setup of the photography for Blue Book and all the rest of it. And so Bissell is at the heart of the UFO file, controlling it with Dulles. When Kennedy gets rid of Dulles, Bissell goes down the chute. Charles Cabell goes down the chute. All the people associated around this deeper, secret, exotic technology program dealing with the UFO file get pushed out. Now, this is part of the fracturing of the United States government, and part of the revolt against Kennedy has to do with pushing out and pushing them out and pushing himself into that line of the UFO file. As we've put on the record repeatedly, one of the problems that this group has is if a president gets his own ideas around this and then deals himself with the Russians, as Kennedy was doing around the UFO file, it subverts all of their non-constitutional activity to rule things with the advanced technology. Kennedy, of course, having a rocky relationship in the beginning with Khrushchev, but developing that relationship, getting through it when Khrushchev was trying to intimidate him and everything, keeping a cool and calm and collected head and earning Khrushchev's respect, works out a deal of sharing the UFO file with his Russian counterpart, and of scrapping the space race and doing a joint moon mission and then a mission to Mars together. Now, those things are on the record now. They're understood after 60 years. We had the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. But the just like the Trump Putin thing was pushed, as this kind of criminal thing, and Trump's in there with Putin. This is the deep state making sure that these people don't get together, because there's something about Russia and America that if they were to join forces and get around the deep state intel Byzantine group that's controlling things, then you'd have a real shot at peace. You'd have a real shot at bringing this out to the public and all the rest. Kennedy saw it after a while as crucial. And what I'm going to expose tonight through the work of George Filer, the major who had all these UFO encounters, is that Kennedy had originally installed a hotline, not just for dealing with nuclear incidents, but for dealing with UFO sightings that could trigger nuclear incidents. And so the UFO file and the original setup inside the Pentagon before the White House got it, he developed a hotline based on the UFO file directly with his Russian counterparts. That's the interesting thing that Filer puts on the record. The other interesting thing, I think, when it comes out, and we keep hearing this story ricochets around about the JFK records and what's in those records, and why, when Trump was talking to Judge Napolitano, he said he couldn't release them because of what was in there. It's my impression that when the CIA director McCone meets Robert Kennedy directly after the Kennedy assassination, they have a meeting where at the farm in Virginia where Kennedy would always meet McCone, probably outside of the ear of listening devices. And somehow in that meeting, Robert Kennedy is able to put some sort of booby trap in the files on the CIA side dealing with the JFK assassination, so that if certain aspects were to be rubbed out of those records, it would set off all these bells and whistles like a dead man switch that would make it all go public. That's why those records are held after 60 years. There's no other logical reason. And a lot of people have said to me over the years, you expect them to leave anything in those records that would actually be damaging? You have to understand the kind of systematic thinking that Robert Kennedy had. And immediately they had a contingency plan, which is, if this intelligence apparatus goes off, and they knew that it was capable of doing that, that we would have some kind of a backup plan, so that at some point here, they would be aware. It's interesting also because Kennedy's relationship with McCone is strained, but McCone is nowhere near the power broker that Dulles was. So when Dulles is fired, it's an affront. And what happens from there is that Dulles already is involved in subverting Kennedy, trying to get him involved in bombing Cuba, trying to get into the salacious details of his private life, and through various conversations with aides revealing this incredible contempt for Kennedy, by the time he gets removed, then it's literally the war of the intel deep state machine to Kennedy. And that's where we get intelligent people like Peter Dale Scott and others saying they needed this deep event to remove Kennedy. That's where they set up the whole apparatus. The UFO file aspect that I bring in here, which I think is the crucial piece, gives them not only do they have the motivation for removing Kennedy and for getting rid of his subversion of their plans, but also to protect a secret project of theirs, which is the development of the space grid using this advanced technology that comes directly out of this X-Tech, which is the UFO file. Now, whether that UFO file relates directly to extraterrestrial technology or if it's a extraterritorial technology, whatever it is, it's so advanced that the physicist Robert Sarbarker, as I've put on the record, said in 1950 and then again in 1984, it was placed above the secrecy of nuclear weapons. So that's where the UFO file sits in the government, regardless of where it comes from. That's the crucial part there. What I said about Trump and Putin is interesting also because like Reagan before him, and Reagan and Gorbachev discussed the UFO file at length, and that's on the record now. We don't have to guess. One of the things that Trump wanted to do was not have anyone from the State Department or intelligence with him. He wanted the meeting with Putin private, just like Reagan and Gorbachev. They didn't want anyone with them except the translator. So over and over again, we've seen from Kennedy and Khrushchev, Reagan and Gorbachev, Putin and Trump, this effort happening. And only when you get a president in, like Biden, who's anti-Russian, they can go after Russia and have this war over Ukraine and all the rest of it with Victoria Nuland and all those crazy hawks over there. Only then are they comfortable in their thing. They don't have to go after the president over the Russian aspect. So this is the nature of it. We need to understand the nature of it because each time, just like the huge thing that came up today with Russia, every time we get around this and it gets us into this territory of, we could be in World War III if they make the wrong guess about us. And we have all these weapons there in Europe. And if we put troops in Ukraine, we'll set off this whole balance of power problem. That's the deep state likes that type of setup, but it's extremely dangerous for America. And it prevents us from having our leaders get together on this very crucial aspect, which is the UFO file. Let's get it straight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Deep State in Space, the COG UFO file revealed. I'm going to do the George Filer section, and then we're going to go to your questions.
Sounds good.
How are you doing out there?
Great. You want some questions?
Sure.
Fuber Fighter says, I suspect that part of the real reason for all the surveillance is to be able to see into the future with more accuracy. So if you have a vast array of surveillance and supercomputers equipped with AI, you can see a little more into the world and make good guesses. Unconscious Zone says, I can't emphasize enough. The reason I intuit they are getting out in front of the UFO file is because of AI decryption capabilities. If you ask it the right questions, these machines would be forced to disclose or be exposed.
Well, it's interesting. Look, I think that they've had AI, though, for 50 years. So they knew all of the, ups and downs of it coming out. And I also think a lot of the hand-wringing over AI is phony because they already know what's going to happen with it and they already know the ramifications. But nonetheless, here it is under our nose. And here they are trying to subvert a lot of our the everyday capabilities of the society for this reason. I'm going to go into Major Filer now, and it's George Filer III. Very interesting character who I said worked deeply in the Air Force in intelligence and was handing over these surveillance photos to our friend Curtis LeMay during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And LeMay wanted to invade Cuba and take out the sites and also engage us in a nuclear war. And it was, Filer was getting this direct info from his interactions. And he relates some of that in his somewhat extraordinary book. The book, I feel, was suppressed inside the UFO field because they were busy lapping up the Melon Elizondo sideshow the CIA invested millions of dollars into, and they got all the pushover UFO people on board with that. And but nonetheless, this story of Filer, what he puts out there, is crucial, especially when we get around the Cuban Missile part. But he also has extraordinary encounters in interviewing people who've had these UFO encounters on military bases. So I'm going to read you a little bit of that, and then we'll get here into your questions. I'm also going to show some of the photos and artist depictions of the different things that he saw. I do want to point out this is the cover of the book, The True Story of an Air Force Intelligence Officer's Life with UFOs, Strange Craft. This book was heavily, they didn't have it out there. It was not pushed, and it was missed because, as I said, it didn't fit the narrative that they were pushing. Now he goes in just before, in 2 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis, they send him over to the Pentagon, and this incredible apparatus that is set up for the Pentagon to communicate directly with their counterparts in Russia in the event of a nuclear sighting, a UFO sighting. And here's what he has to say about it. I believe the dedicated communication system I saw in the Pentagon was the military back channel that the Kennedy administration used to communicate with Soviet military leaders during October 1962. According to the UFO incident during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is an article written by Francis Richard Nycap, quote, one of our major concerns was the possibility of accidental nuclear war caused by jittery air defense radar men mistaking UFOs for Russian missiles or jets. According to Ridge, radar operators got the willies when a UFO made its way onto American airspace during the most dangerous moments of the standoff. The object was painted by the AN-FP6 radar with a radar reflectivity similar to the F-106 or larger in size, very large craft. By the time the UFO crossed into Rome, New York airspace, it was cruising straight and level at 73,000 feet and was pulling away from an F-106 at full afterburner, which is moving Mach 2.3. Air defenses followed the object as it flew across Canada, over Alaska, and into altitudes where it could not be reached by the pursuit of jets. Now notice it does the same route as we hear about those objects last year, which, oh, hey, they're disappearing into Canada and Alaska. Something very unusual about that. While at the Pentagon, Filer was shown dedicated communications equipment that handled messages between the U.S. military and a Soviet military command center. According to a higher-ranking officer George spoke with, the system had been put in place long before the Cuban Missile Crisis, so both sides could communicate when UFOs were active. So the Kennedy administration already has an early warning system for UFOs set up. This is crucial because by the time you get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, they're using it for other things, but it's already there. It's already been created. The United States and the Soviet Union had nearly come to nuclear blows before, when Soviet defenses picked up dozens of UFOs entering the Soviet bloc airspace in the late 50s, Filer said. These unknown formations of radar blips led American and Russian military leaders to write a treaty secretly that stated one side would inform the other that strange aircraft were approaching their airspace that were not ballistic missiles. This gets to the heart of Kennedy asking on November 12th, 10 days before his assassination, for the CIA director to hand all of the high threat cases of UFO sightings directly over to the Soviets. This is the nature of the problem. Kennedy is sharing that UFO thing, and the X-Protect group is sitting there in the middle of this conversation thinking, how are we going to prevent this? We need somebody in there who has a totally different policy. And they have Johnson, and a lot of people have Johnson pegged as, orchestrating the Kennedy assassination and all the rest of it. Look, I will tell you this. He's going to be under indictment because of the Bobby Baker scandal And because his business associates have already, Billy Celestis has already gone to jail. They already have him taking bribes, doing all these other things. And Kennedy, in secret, has already announced he's not going to have Johnson on the ticket. So Johnson, if he hears of something else that he can go along with in order to become president instead of going to prison, he'll go along with it. And I'm sure he had, there's certainly a lot of trail of Johnson being involved around the Kennedy assassination, but the orchestration comes from this deeper X-Protect group operating inside that shadowy CIA corridor of aerospace and with the aerospace companies. Now, I'm going to get to something that Filer witnessed, which was when he interviewed, and this is what kind of came out as the headline for the book, which was, that we had taken a number of craft had come over this air base in New Jersey, and that what had taken place was they had a being there that had been shot. And so the headline was Space Alien Shot and Killed in Burlington County? The story comes from 1978, and that's Filer there right in the middle of it. So he's talking about the people involved, and he says, Morse, who was the base operational officer, and the state policeman came across the body, Filer said. Morse told me he radioed the security command post at McGuire and told the supervisor, hey, there's a body out here. The security commander then asked Morse to put the trooper on the radio. Morse's supervisor told the state trooper that the matter was now under Air Force jurisdiction and that McGuire would handle it. After the trooper left, Morse waited alone with the entity, which had collapsed and died near a defunct New Jersey Air National Guard hangar. As he waited for backup personnel to arrive, Morse noticed that the body put off a chemical smell. Morse was out there guarding the body when a bunch of guys in blue military fatigues and blue berets arrived at C-141 from Wright-Patterson, Filer said. They told Morse something like, you can leave now. They were very nasty toward him. He had been out there in the middle of the night guarding the body in the cold, so he moved back some distance but didn't leave. The blue berets are something that's talked about as, that's kind of a street legend in the UFO file. They relate directly to the blue secrecy and the blue Enigma aspect that we've put forward around the UFO file. You're going to find whenever it relates directly to materials, blue is always the kind of steganography that they use. How he got there. The 438th Military Airlift Wing Command post told George that an alien body had been found at the end of the runway by an Air Force security policeman and a New Jersey state policeman. I was also told that base medical personnel had been out to see if they could resuscitate the alien. Filer said there was mention that a special team was arriving from Washington, D.C. to handle the cleanup, the Blue Berets. Morse also told George that one of the soldiers who arrived on the C-141 used a garden sprayer to coat the alien body with a clear liquid. Several of the Blue Berets wrapped the body in plastic sheeting and put it in a wooden crate holding the body in an aluminum box the size of a military casket. The Blue Berets loaded the container into an ambulance and drove it off. George took a good look at his notes and shook his head. The master sergeant had told George about the Blue Berets. The mention of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as the destination for the entity's bodies fits the storyline all the way back to the Roswell incident. It's a very interesting story he was involved with, and the only drawing that they have of the being, which apparently was being chased and could do all kinds of things, could disappear and reappear and move very fast and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, they shot it and killed it. And it's kind of a classic gray figure from this New Jersey base incident in 1978. Now, what's interesting is if you go a year later in 1979, you're going to find in Dover, Massachusetts, there's a legend in Dover, Massachusetts of the Dover Demon. And when I was thinking about their account of this, again, they see lights, military are called in or whatever, but a number of people are witness to this being there right in Dover. And Dover is maybe, how far is Dover from here?
A good 40 minutes.
About 40 minutes. Very close and very suburban kind of area. if you go back and read those news reports, it's quite remarkable because it had these piercing red eyes, kind of like the Mothman and that whole kind of thing. And again, the beings aspect, very close to what they described on the New Jersey case. Now, what's interesting for me is Filer's report in his book was buried very quickly. I found that interesting because, again, it was dealing with beings. And the thing that they've been promoting with this UFO threat doesn't have anything to do with beings. It's just this ominous thing that's coming in from somewhere. George was the only Air Force investigator to interview witnesses and compile a report on the day it occurred. The news media, UFO documentary producers, and investigators have tried to put the pieces together in the years since, but George was there, and that was the timetable of the alien at Fort Dix. Very interesting story, and it all has to do with the strange craft approaching Fort Dix at about 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, two other quick things about Filer, and then we'll move to your questions.
Okay.
One thing about Filer is that when he is in, this is a really strange story, when he's in England, they're sending him up in these container craft, which refuel these different airplanes in the sky. And what happens is he comes face to face with this gigantic craft, and they follow it, and it goes right over Stonehenge. Interestingly enough. And this is what freaks him out. This is before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it gives him that heads up before all this stuff happens. That his account of that story in there, I think, is very, very interesting. But what happens is it triggers a memory he had of being 6 years old and seeing a craft come down, and then a woman comes out of the craft who is blonde and very tall and in a blue suit. And she, is doing the whole "I'm a visitor from another place" and all the rest of it. That's all in the Filer account. And Filer has an impeccable background, military history, 40 years. And this guy was just, brushed over while we were getting the Corbell sideshow and the jellyfish UFO and all that junk. So the story is loaded, and the piece about the UFO surveillance equipment matches something that Philip Corso put on the record. And Colonel Corso really gave us something, I think, very important about this, which is that the reasons they were using the early versions that were developing these space planes that still hold some of the speed records is they were put in place to chase UFOs, and that the Kennedy brothers, both of them on a monthly basis, wanted updates on how those chases were going, and that he was part of the team that was giving the Kennedys these updates about the results of them chasing these crafts with the X-59s and the other craft. So for me, to kind of sum it all up, basically, since that era, where we almost have more of a window of what was going on there, they've been involved with tracking this other version of advanced technology, and we've used our very best. We're using paperclip scientists to develop these space planes to chase after these other things, to figure out who's operating them. And we're also using our very best in cases like Aztec. This whole Kona code that we revealed last week is very important. The whole thing about Kingman and Ossining, Nellis, and Aztec being what that code is, the Kona Blue program, which the government has admitted to now as of 2 weeks ago. So they've been engaged in a process of observing this advanced craft. Now, who's developing it and who's operating it and what their relationship is with the government, and what kind of ability do they have to intimidate this government, what we have learned from all that stuff is kept under a completely secret process. And it relates directly to geopolitics. It relates to technological development, economic development. So we're right in the heart of that mystery. That's why the whole aspect of the deep state in space has to be considered with the two major points of secrecy in the entire government: the UFO File program, which is the top secret, and the continuity of government program, which is the mirror of that. They're both completely top secret programs with no oversight from the traditional overt government that you and I live in on a regular basis. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay. Mark Hospian says, drive up Strawberry Hill Road in Dover at night. You'll see it. That it takes me back. I remember going up Strawberry Hill Road, and then you're supposed to turn your lights off.
Oh.
Anyway, and there's sort of coast and neutral down. Anyway, good
So
times.
is Strawberry Hill Road the thing with all the stones and where is it in Dover? Ask that person where they have all of these stones. There's a huge wall up there and people hang out there. That's supposedly where the Dover Demon is seen.
And BW says, I have a book on that being. DJ Sir, please read the books of retired policeman Robert Ellis Cahill, who wrote extensively on the Dover Demon and many other paranormal happenings in New England. That sounds like fun.
I bet there's a lot to work with there. There's the Bridgewater Triangle, right? Very interesting indeed. Yes, what do you got?
Okay, so BW also said chemical smell tracks with Robert Sarbacher's theory that they were constructed beings from earlier.
Yeah, this is interesting. Let's think about this for a minute. You have all these encounters with people. You go through all the John Mack abductions, Fowler, Stringfield, all those people. And they have all these cases where, these people get examined and they interact with those beings. And very often the beings are some variation of the Greys. But I'll tell you this, the more I look at that, I wonder if that isn't kind of a blank template, because if you really look at certain cases like the Betty and Barney Hill case, it doesn't really look like a Grey. She said basically it looked like a human, but there was no hair and no nose. But she didn't have the eyes all big and all that kind of thing. So there's something very interesting about that. We also have the huge reference back there in the Casey work, which brings us into almost an occult way of looking at this. But that very early on, the Atlantean groups had developed these automatons, and that the automatons were a mix of human and kind of Atlantean cyborg, and they would, mix animal parts in and create this kind of slave. And that part of the problem with the Atlanteans coming in to Egypt was that they came in with thousands of these things, automatons. So the idea of what happened to the Atlantean technology, was it all lost? Or does it show up later, as Casey mentioned, that's Ezekiel looking at Atlantean craft. Then we wonder, well, what about the automatons? Did they keep that knowledge, at least, of that kind of technology? So Sarbacher did mention in his lengthy interview with UFO investigators in the 1980s that what they had figured out about the beings inside is they were constructed and they were kind of insect-like so that they could absorb the fast acceleration and all the rest of it. This is what he remembered from, and he talked that they had this incredible background of looking into and reverse engineering that technology. So he said he was surprised there in 1984 that all of this hadn't come out. It was quite remarkable. And I put on the record with Sarbacher, and he was somebody who's on the same level as Oppenheimer. I mean, he was a student of Einstein. He was on the cover of Time magazine. And as I've said many times, you can't even find a Wikipedia page on him now. But Sarbacher is best friends with Townsend Brown. So you have a real block there of the secret technology and X-share people who want to share this X technology with the culture and move it forward. And the X-Protect groups kind of, either rolling over them or eliminating them from history. And it's interesting because one of the things that Townsend Brown's daughter told me was that when he decided not to play ball with the deep state and do some of the darker projects they wanted to do, that the threats were hard and heavy, and he would take his family. And she remembered the security guards who had machine guns, who were there on Eleuthera Island in the hot zone. And they were, overlooking this whole process till things cool down for a couple of months, and then he'd come back to the United States. So that group that's operating, the X-Protect group, is not necessarily always sanctioned just by an overt public government. This is something that's operating inside of the deep state, in which those people don't have any control over at all. Yes.
Heather Quinn says, you mentioned Atlantean technology. The U.S. found much of it buried in Mosul.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, they found a lot there in Iraq, and that gets to something that in some of the interviews I've had with Dr. Farrell, we talk about the archaeology wars, but this idea of those groups searching for this ancient advanced technology is on the record. Look, I have a CIA file, which is from 1964, which somehow they released, which is kind of remarkable, of them infiltrating the Casey organization looking for information about the Hall of Records. So, we know that they've been involved in searches for things like Noah's Ark. We know they've been involved in different searches for ancient Sumerian technology and things like that. The two-eye stone out of the Casey readings is the construction, the means of construction are in the Hall of Records. This is what I think they were looking for. And the two-eye stone is the kind of the secret to what the Atlanteans had as a huge worldwide power grid. And that's when you see all those standing stones all over the place, they are indications of something, that was interacting. It's like if the society were wiped out years later, people would see different radar towers and things and cell phone towers. They're references. These are different leftover references. When we look at it, we don't even understand it. And of course, part of the two-eye technology is spiritual as well. So we really have a hard time getting it. Yes.
Heather Quinn follows up. The University of Pennsylvania transferred relics of the Atlantean tech to CIA.
Yes. Well, that's very interesting because Casey indicated it was the University of Pennsylvania that would recover the emblems of the Firestone. Remember, the Firestone was kind of like, it's almost like that iPhone, iPad portable version of the two-eye stone. So if you had it, you could still click in. And Casey was clear. He's like, they're finding them. They're finding these Firestones they know so little about. And this is 1933 in the Yucatan that they were finding them. What happened to them? He said, I don't want there to be any confusion. They're going to go directly to the Penn State. So you got UPenn, you got Penn State. There's something involved there. But what's interesting is the University of Pennsylvania over and over again comes up when it comes to secret projects dealing with ancient archaeology. And a lot of people who end up, and you could say there's a certain amount of this that would be expected, but a lot of people who end up obfuscating seem to have that UPenn in their background. What else did I have? I had something else on that, but keep going.
Ray Story says, Paul Hellyer said that we are dealing with about 200 types of off-world visitors before he died. We need more defense ministers like him to talk to the UN again about all the other beings. And Gerald Sheeran says, if they kill a Boeing whistleblower, what chance does a genuine UFO whistleblower have?
Yeah, those are both great questions. I had Paul Hellyer on the show before he passed away, and he told me a very series of very interesting things, and he understood the financial system corruption, and he understood the UFO file obfuscation, and he understood the framework I was saying to him about X-Protect back then, 2016. He understood perfectly. And he had outlined something very similar in his own work. But that's fascinating, isn't it? As a former defense minister of Canada, he went on the record about it. He knew it was crucial. One of the things that he told me, which I think is important to note, is that the military of the United States and the military of Canada, and that would directly crisscross with NORAD, COG, that they're in charge and they're in touch on the UFO file, and that the Prime Minister in Canada and the President of the United States don't have to have anything to do. So if there's a UFO incident, their militaries deal with each other completely outside of any constitutional control of the government. So no presidents are allowed. It's just the militaries working and interfacing. To me, that cut very close to the truth. And he being the defense minister, who else would know it any better? So I think he really gave us something there. Yes.
Okay. Matakwe Oyasin. Antarctica always seems to come up, now with COG. Does DJ think this could be the breakaway civilization's place on Earth? And Raz says, ask DJ how the Avro arrow plays into the UFO file.
Well, Avro being the original, where they try to create this flying UFO, and it was developed first in Canada. Those are very interesting projects if you track them over time. Very often these things disappear and then something pops up in its place and you see, oh, hey, it's the X something. That's where a lot of the X-teganography tracking came out of. The question is the interface. If somebody knows on the American side that the Russians are developing this advanced UFO technology, or they have their own program for tracking UFOs, where they come from, who's operating them, what kind of propulsion system is used, and all the rest, then, for my money, what happens is both teams realize they're on the same page. The problem is, I don't think that we're that much more advanced than the Russians. As a matter of fact, their program is so robust around the UFO file that it might really be neck and neck on that. What you do notice is that, especially with the Ukraine war, the language started to change over in Russia. And when they would have these incidents where they would shoot these things down, they would say, we shot down a UFO. That's really provocative language for the Russians to use. Meaning, if you really want to go for it and take us on in this war, we might start talking about UFOs. And it's America that really doesn't want it out. That's where the basis of Exprotect sits. And the Russians have kept, it tightly also. I think that the balance of power really is in those two countries. Even when you've seen China rise, and China has their own UFO program, I think that Russia and America stand head and shoulders above anybody when it comes to that. And in my, the way that I look at this, that really gives them kind of, that gives them the final word on the advanced technology side over anybody else on the planet. Now, it's interesting because you get very interesting suggestions from Germany, from South America, from Argentina, that there's a network of advanced technology, and that you're not just talking about a United States versus Russia problem. So yeah, it's a kind of a geography dealing with advanced technology. And of course, you've got all this information pointing directly down to Antarctica. And, we did an incredible show on the International Geophysical Year, but I have 3 episodes on Antarctica, Lloyd Berkner, JFK, Byrd, and those 3 episodes are all coming up after we do this huge blowout May 3rd. And remember, May 3rd, the craze in the hot zone. Mm-hmm. That's coming up, 2-hour presentation, Friday, May 3rd. You don't want to miss it. This is something we've been working on for a while. Yes, Miss Olivia.
So the story you were telling earlier, Tim Houston wanted to know, does Richard Doty also tell that story?
I wonder about, I don't think I've ever heard Doty, but he's probably the kind of guy who definitely would have heard of it. Very interesting story, in my opinion, that Filer put on the record. And like I said, the UFO community rolled right over it. They don't have any need for a real story. This is the nature of the problem. They're just looking for, the jellyfish. They're looking, the whole team that you have out there, most of it's controlled by Melon, according to his own quote, So I think at this point, if I hear UFO researchers defending Melon or Elizondo anymore. It's kind of like, the guy already, it's like in a murder case. If the guy confesses to murder, what are you doing hanging around? I mean, it's kind of a done deal. And that whole thing needs to move on from the CIA op. They're up to other ops already. And, the idea of staking anything more on that as a professional researcher, forget it. That whole field has kind of collapsed in a sense and probably should be replaced with something much more influenced on the deep state research side. Then you'd have a whole different approach on the whole thing. And you'd never have ridiculous stuff like, the Tom DeLonge type thing. I mean, it's interesting because if you've been around deep state research, and that's one of the reasons why the whole Netflix thing on Casolaro was so offensive with them doing faction, where they just roll in their own facts and mix it with fiction. And the guy dressing up as Casolaro and all that. I went through it last week and really blew it, blew it sky high in terms of the artificiality of the whole thing, including the fact that they did their own messed with version of the Zapruder film and pretended that's what the public was seeing. I mean, they had carte blanche to just lie, 24/7. And even some of the like Rolling Stone were like, aren't you worried that like the viewer might get the wrong idea and think that that is real, the thing you're putting out there? And they're like, no, we took this whole Dogville approach, dude. I mean, that has nothing to do with research. So you run the risk in the period that we're in, where the independent ideas and the independent media has gone so mainstream that there's just a lot of interlopers and opportunists involved. And I guess, it's always been true, but it's particularly true now. So you're going to get very watered down versions of these things. And what you're going to need is very potent researchers with potent visions of these things and potent, research facts and all the rest of it. And the watered down stuff needs to retreat further and further. So it'll be very stiff, straight contrast between the genuine UFO file work, for example, and this nonsense, the Atlantean work. You've got the mystery school piece mixed with very good researchers. These are the things we can put on the record. This information is there. And what you have is this marketing thing and intel thing on top, sucking up people's interest in the thing and pulling it over here and being like, oh, you think the like the counterfeit conspiracy, this is what it is. Oh, you like that Casolaro story? Hey, look, this is a guy, oh, he's going over the edge. He's dressing up like Casolaro, that gets you so far away from the actual story. It's entertainment, and it's also diluting entertainment. So I guess when you get to the core of a story, if you're dealing with the UFO file, there's so many real facts to be had. And we don't, you just don't need the counterfeit part. You start to find it a necessity to separate the counterfeit conspiracy aspects from the real thing. And you have to be aligned with the real thing.
What's interesting is when you're saying that, this is really tricky to describe, but when you find out about a conspiracy, something that is upsetting to you, and they turn it into entertainment, and you watch it in a kind of a relaxed alpha state, then it's changing your brain's reaction to the facts. So instead of being alarmed by it or activated by it, you just sort of passively accept it, and you sort of,
that's really
it puts you to sleep about the whole thing. And is that the purpose of making all of these shows, is to change your attitude about it so that it's no longer alarming, disturbing, and that you don't have to do anything about it?
That's really interesting because remember we started the show with the whole New York Times being like, hey, the deep state's awesome, it turns out. And them doing this kind of fun, like, hangout video with the deep state and like, hey, they like Taylor Swift. Good, like Taylor Swift, just don't destroy America. This is directly from the article video from the New York Times. When we hear, and it goes right along with the point you just made, watch how they water down deep state. When we hear deep state, instead of recoiling, we should rally. We should think about the workers otherwise known as our public servants, the everyday superheroes who wake up ready to dedicate their careers and their lives to serving us. These are the Americans we employ, even though their work is often invisible. It makes our lives better. So, like, don't think about it. Go back to sleep, you know? So, what if the CIA set up to assassinate Julian Assange? You know, they're protecting you. So, they want to go have a dance off for Taylor Swift. I feel like apologizing to Taylor Swift now. Look, I'm going to wrap this up with a very interesting loop. Now, so much of the work that we did tonight covering George Filer, so much of his duties took place at MacDill, and he said a lot of interesting things about MacDill, which is the Air Force base that Gregory Gillett, the new COG commander, comes out of. It has a huge UFO signature, including the fact that there were a number of stories of them storing UFO craft directly at MacDill, and that things like, for example, the Jackie Gleason story didn't actually happen at Homestead, that they happened at MacDill, and it was easier to identify Homestead so that national security was kept safe. So MacDill is a big deal in those circles. As I mentioned, Glenn Van Herk, who was the previous COG commander, came out of the 509th, which is the original group that recovered the Roswell wreckage. Check this out. MacDill's association with UFOs also comes up in the famous Project Blue Book report by the Air Force relating to the investigations of unidentified flying objects, and now part of the National Archives. This is also in the Filer book. According to an Air Force document drawn from the report, on June 5th, 1961, an F-102 fighter jet was scrambled after witnesses spotted a star-shaped UFOs in the skies near MacDill. The object, according to the document, had been on the base radar for 7 days. Aircraft reported contact but experienced trouble and could not complete intercept due to jamming, the document says. Whether claims about MacDill UFOs today end up in any Project Blue Book of the future remains to be seen. For now, MacDill commands running operations across the war-torn Middle East and supporting commandos around the globe. They're a diversion that brings a few grins. By the way, MacDill runs all the operations controlling the hot zone. So if you're looking in the Bahamas around the UFO piece and all the rest of it, you're going to find them observing everything in the Bahamas to Cuba or whatever, looking, of course, for provocations, but studying that whole UFO landscape that is so heavy duty there in Bimini. So if we have the COG commander again, we've got something very strange going on here, because over and over again, we have these COG guys and their connection with the UFO file, the bases they come out of, are always deeply steeped in UFO lore. As a matter of fact, the head of Space Force comes out of Malmstrom Air Force Base, where that's where they had the original nuclear stand down of this UFO hovering over the base and shutting off their various nuclear missiles. Look, there's a reason for those types of things. That's what steganography is all about, you know. It's not so much checking out people making eye symbols for Illuminati and things of this nature. I'm sure that they do, but I think the steganography is deep. And those are the types of things I think we need to look for. And I think in the story of Filer, who's now 89 years old, and his unusual interaction with this, the UFO file over 4 decades, really, including his own unusual story, as I said, of being 6-year-old child and seeing this incredible craft land on a railroad track and being taken aboard the craft and seeing this incredible blonde woman who was in a blue jumpsuit and had, you know, piercing blue eyes. And then for the rest of his life, he's going to have a series, you know, part of his job is going to be watching the UFO file. Who in the early 1940s is landing craft and talking to children about what they're going to be dealing with later in the future about UFOs? It's quite fascinating when you take it on those levels. And I think that his story in particular is interesting because in his book, he goes into how Prince Philip takes him aside and wants to hear every little detail about this gigantic UFO he's just encountered. And then he tells him all the different details. And then he says to Philip, basically, like, what do you guys know about this? And why are you so interested? And Philip says, well, because, dear boy, we've had a number of them, but I've seen them myself. Apparently, not only that, he not only saw a craft, but he saw something getting out of that craft very close by to the royal residence. So Philip was very interested in Flyer's story of this massive craft over Stonehenge. And if you dig into that, they understand on that level, whether it's, the Queen of England who's passed away now, or King Charles or whatever, they have a real heavy duty network around that UFO file. And so whenever you get on those levels, they want every little piece of information they can get. And I think that Q&A session that he has in the book with Prince Philip is particularly telling. And with that, Miss Olivia, that is our report for tonight.
Okay.
George Flyer, the Flyer File, and Deep State COG UFO File revealed. And of course, the great quotes from Peter Dale Scott. I'm going to round out with a quote from Scott, and then we'll yell at your super chats.
Sounds good.
This is very interesting because Professor Scott, there's so many key moments in his book, but I think how he tracks in how a lot of the system came out of J. Edgar Hoover's ability to, basically develop this incredible surveillance network. And then he asks basically, where did it go? And it is really the COG program that picks up on it. But what he has to say is doomsday mania, I would once have said, had restored Hooverism. I would now say that COG planning in restoring specific Hoover techniques has gone far beyond Hooverism to something far more dangerous. In addition, some of the illegalities that Hoover merely planned for, like detention, Rumsfeld and Cheney, after planning for 2 decades, actually implemented on September 11th, 2001. The COG measures implemented on 9/11 have supplemented Hoover's powers with parallel powers developed by the CIA and NSA as foreseen in the Houston Plan, plus the worst FBI illegalities from the emergency era of the 1960s. Torture practiced by the FBI in an extreme situation became embodied in legal memoranda as a standard way to interrogate suspects. Hoover's actions, this is very interesting. His tactics to crush the Klan were clearly illegal, but they were in response to murders and a challenge to public order. They were in their way measured. And what he's saying about the secret powers, they no longer have the justification for it. With the implementation of COG emergency powers to 9/11, we have indeed seen an exponential expansion of America as a dual state to what Dana Priest called 2 governments. The one operated more or less in the open, the other a parallel top secret government visible to only a carefully vetted cadre. The second government, called by Priest Top Secret America, should not be thought of as identical to the deep state, but rather as the radically expanded institutional base for the deep state, ensuring an ever greater share of the national budget for top-down programs to constrain dissent from abroad and at home. Wow, is that telling? And that is Professor Scott writing in 2014. So, this is the nature of the situation that we find ourselves in. For me, what I do is I take the deep state research and I bring the UFO file aspect in, and then I think we get something, if you start to pursue that COG secrecy with the UFO file secrecy, then you're dealing with exotic technology, then you're dealing with all these other programs. That gets us much closer to the truth, in my opinion, and that's what we're aiming to do on this show. It's been great to be here with you tonight. And Miss Olivia, we'll take your super chats.
Okay. First, I want to say Maddie Mosef says, freaking love Fridays because of DJ. I completely agree. It's the highlight of my week. So thank you to Robert LaFollette, Wolfgang McCarthy, Detritus, Slow Time, Boba the Clown, Calvin F. Center, Jay Parsons, Happy Camper, Short Order Cook 1, The Bikini Truther, Eurythmia's Fun, Erica Swenson Elliott, McMurphy 321, Terry Doherty, Bella B, Jake, Amarillo Gunrunners, Empire of Light, Lisa Davey, Copernicus, Robert Scott, and David John Moan, and Jessica Rodriguez. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Incredible. And we really appreciate your support. And of course, to all our subscribers, we couldn't do it without you. We'll be back with you next week. Coming up in April, we have the 6-year anniversary of the X series, a very special 3-hour show. And then May 3rd, as I mentioned, very special 2-hour presentation, The Craze in the Hot Zone. This is Atlantis. Some parting shots for you there of Kennedy dealing with his CIA directors. And, you know, it's interesting when I think and I read about what Kennedy did in order to make sure that the Central Intelligence Agency didn't engage us in a war in Russia. We're making all the same mistakes 60 years later, but the stakes are even that much higher. And it would be fantastic for us to reflect on John Kennedy's leadership in that period and to see that this is what really worked and prevented a nuclear war. So Kennedy, although being eliminated by the CIA, won in this sense, in that America and the world was not embroiled in a massive nuclear war. Now, the security state that Kennedy warned us about, we're looking at right there in the COG NORTHCOM commander, who, under emergency circumstances, make no mistake, would take complete control of the country. That's an unconstitutional situation, never envisioned in the Constitution under any circumstances. And NORTHCOM is an illegal entity. It was created basically in that craze of the terrorism, fanaticism after George W. Bush got us involved in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, that's the nature of the situation. And so we've inherited 2 lines there. And the Kennedy strand is still very much there. And we need to reflect on Kennedy's leadership in keeping us out of a nuclear war and preventing the CIA from getting their invasion of Cuba and other things. So it's an incredible reflection in that sense. And of course, Kennedy directly with the UFO file, trying to work with other nations around that. All very important and advanced. And it's funny, there's a great quote from Mikhail Gorbachev, and he visits the Texas School Book Depository, which, let me tell you, politicians know how to send messages. For him to go to the Texas School Book Depository, where Kennedy was supposedly assassinated from, and make a speech, this is quite remarkable. Of course, we know Oswald was a patsy and never shot anything from there. But what he said was that the more that he studied President Kennedy, the more he realized just how far ahead of his time Kennedy was, and he marveled at it, saying, how did Kennedy understand basically the structure of the world as well as he did, that even now in our national security negotiations, we're still catching up to some of the things he was trying to do. And of course, Kennedy, in his famous America University speech, said, what kind of a peace do we seek? What kind of a peace do we want? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, because in the final analysis, we all breathe the same air, and we cannot afford to fight a war where even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. I mean, it's an undeniable wisdom, and that's the wisdom of the ages that we need now. And if anything, we need to reduce the tensions with Russia dramatically. And I think exposing that UFO aspect would be crucial in relation to all that. Right now, everything is a wild card, as we know. So we'll see you all next week, but I want you to have a fantastic weekend. And it's been great being here with you. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs before we go. And it's the Ideas Room. Let's see. Tina Boric says good night. Tim Houston, it's good to see you out there. Thomas Ball, Happy Hermit, Wayne Peak. I know Gigi Young was out there. Gigi did an incredible Q&A the other day, and she did the Dark Side of Disclosure. You have got to watch those videos. They are extraordinary. She's just killing it over there. at her site, ggyoung.com, and on her YouTube channel. And of course, we have some exciting interviews coming up. Also, Gigi is on that. Farrell, Bosley. We're going to have an incredible lineup coming up soon. Incredible show. Cece, thank you very much. It's great to see you. Golden Girl, cool show. Loves it, y'all. I should have done that with an accent. You know it. Modwiz, he's out there. That's a good one. What does it say? Dolly the clone sheep was fragile and genetic mess, except for photo ops and hype. Dolly is no exemplar of a refined process. That is really a good point. Peace, love, and blessings to all from music. Great crowd out there. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Dominique, Tubatorium made it here in the past hour. Good to be here. I drove a long rainy construction Friday commute. You made it. And there you are. Thank you, DJ and Olivia, VKK, Ryan Perella, Tim Houston, BW, Heidi Reynolds. Great show tonight. Thank you, Heidi. It's great to have you here. Gigi is great, says Guitar Malade. That's absolutely true. Checking out the archive is always awesome. It's been doing that lately. Yes. There's a lot of interesting things coming up that you're going to want to make sure you're on the newsletter for. Great show, DJ and Olivia. Thank you, Roosevelt, sir. It's great to see you out there. Jessica Rodriguez. Thank you, Jessica. Have a wonderful week, everyone. See you next Friday. Everyone, it's been great to be here with you. And remember, we do have that Bobby Kennedy announcement. The VP coming up the 26th. Cross your fingers that something changes there and something good would happen. We will see. Wait, Dark Journalist, write Trump a check for $450 million. I'll give it all the consideration it's worth. Thank you very much. And, never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and it could be again. It says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
It never really ends. Thank you very much, everyone. And we'll see you all next week. Have a great weekend. Talk to you soon.
God bless.